Stephen Wilson, I'd like to start by congratulating you because I came to your Dolby Atmos demo yesterday, and just putting the Atmos aside for the moment, I thought it was one of the most compelling demos I've ever seen at any hi-fi show. And I've been to loads. Wow. Because, I'll tell you why.
Okay.
PMC came out, gave us a tech spiel, 3 minutes, nothing too in-depth. And then you came out and talked about music, which you would not believe how rare those kinds of things are at these events. Right. And you played music that you don't often hear at hi-fi shows. Do you want to tell us like some of the songs you played?
So I play 10 pieces of music, not all tracks, some of the little extracts. I play music by Tears for Fears, Franky Goes to Hollywood, XTC, Van Morrison, The Who, Sinéad O'Connor, King Crimson, Aha, and I'm probably missing a couple, and myself. And I end the session with a track from my last album. Right. But I mean, I'm really happy to hear you say that, because one of the things, of course, I mean, just in the last session we did, a question that comes up quite a lot in the QA at the end is, how do you make decision about what you put where? And I'm like, I approach it like an idiot. But what I mean by that is I approach it like a musician. If it sounds good, I do it. Right. I don't intellectualize it. So if I've got like a harmony vocal part or a counterpoint, musical part, I put it where it sounds right to me as a musician. Right. And I think that's the difference between me doing this and maybe trained engineers and sort of producers doing this, is that I'm none of those things. I was never trained to do this. Right. I approached it like an idiot, like, oh, well, that sounds good. Why can I not do that? Of course I can do that. It just sounds good. So no one was telling me, oh, you can't do that, or you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't do this. And for whatever reason, that approach, luckily for me, seems to have resonated quite well with listeners, because, to state the obvious, listeners are also music lovers. Right. They're not interested in the technique, they're interested in losing themselves inside the music. So maybe in my sense, I've just kind of lucked out because I exist in between these two worlds somehow. I mean, you seem to have become the go-to guy for Atmos remixes. And I've got to say this, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but for mainly left of centre music choices, right? I know you've done Van Morrison. I actually did a list of the songs you played yesterday. But Gentle Giant, I mean, I didn't even know who they were. I mean, and that was fascinating to hear. I know you've mentioned them on your podcast once, but then The Who and Van Morrison, I guess, are more sort of middle of the road. But then you've done all sorts, I guess, that you wouldn't really hear, even not at a hi-fi show, and it wouldn't necessarily be like top 20 fodder, if you like, right? For sure. And I mean, is that how you see it? I don't know. No, you're right. I think it's changing a little bit for me. I am getting offered more mainstream stuff now, but certainly when I started. So I think what you have to understand is where I come from. I come from the tradition of progressive rock. That's what people think I do. Right. I always kick against that to an extent. Right. But I also acknowledge that there's a reason why people think that. I do understand that. So I came from this tradition of progressive rock. So the first jobs I got offered were things like King Crimson, Jethro Tull, Gentle Giant, which broadly speaking, come from the same tradition. But now I seem to have made a name for myself. I'm getting offered all sorts of things. And actually the irony is I'm not really a 70s guy. I'm an 80s, but I grew up in the 80s. Yeah. So for me, I'm really excited now because I'm doing Franky, and I'm doing, stuff that actually is stuff I grew up with and bought when I was a kid, Tears for Fears. I bought those records the day they came out. So I'm really happy that it's beginning to diversify now. But certainly, yes, to begin with, I was doing music that I was associated with, generically speaking, that I was most associated with. Yeah. Right, okay. Now, one question that comes up a lot in my head is that we come to a demo like this, it's super impressive. You've got speakers above you, to the sides, behind, obviously at the front. And then you got to ask I'll ask myself after a demo like that is, how do I get that at home? Because obviously we're at a hi-fi trade fair, and that is something that people are always considering, right? How do we bring this experience home? And I think it's possibly more challenging to bring that home than your average stereo system. Yeah, I'm glad you qualified it with your last statement, because that's also true of stereo too. You can come to a fair like this and hear the most extraordinary, $1 billion stereo system, And it's like, you can't take that home. So it's also true stuff. But you're right, there is an extra level of complexity in terms of spatial, because it's the fact you have to have multiple speakers, and how many people are going to persuade their partner, for example, to completely redesign their front room with a Dolby Atmos system in mind. I think that's where, and I talk about this in the presentation, how obviously there is a history of spatial audio going back to the 70s with quad and the 90s with 5.1. What's different this time? What's different this time is that you can listen to spatial audio binaurally.
Yes.
And no, it isn't as good, and no, it isn't the same. It's still pretty cool, I think. And obviously one of the things I do when I'm mixing my spatial audio mixes is I stick it on my phone, I stick the mix on my phone, I get on the treadmill, I put on my AirPod Maxes, and I listen to how my Atmos mix is going to sound binaurally. It still sounds pretty cool to me, and it's definitely, for me, it's still a step up from stereo. It still has an additional three-dimensional quality to it. And of course the caveat to all of this is it depends how well the mix is done.
Right.
I've heard some terrible mixes that sound like a complete mess binaurally, you know. But again, almost anything you can level at spatial audio as a criticism or a sort of Achilles heel, almost everything you can also say, but that's also true of stereo. There are terrible stereo mixes out there. There are terrible Atmos mixes out there. So, but I think the ultimate answer to your question is that you have to acknowledge when you're doing a spatial audio mix that most people will only ever get to hear it binaurally through headphones, sound bars, etc.
So Hans Martin Buff, I met with him a few months ago. He had just finished the Peter Gabriel, and he told me, yeah, the binaural headphone version is about 50% of what you get from speakers. And would you agree with that? I mean,
Yes.
Is that a fair assessment of
I
things?
think that's yeah. I mean, it's as good as any sort of quantifiable figure you can put on it. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I do all of my listening, iPhone, AirPods.
Yeah.
I love the Talking Heads mixes that Eric Thorngren and Jerry Harrison did. Eric Thorngren, I think, passed away yesterday or the day before.
I heard about that. Yeah.
Yeah. But those are absolutely superb. One thing that's really interesting about Hans Martin Buff's Peter Gabriel mix is that the dynamic range of the end result is far greater than the stereo mixes. Is that something that you've noticed or you bake into your Atmos mixes?
Well, it's actually not even something that we choose to do. There is a restriction with Dolby Atmos. You can, if you deliver a mix to Apple Music, for example, that it's more than -18 LUFS, they'll throw it out.
Right.
They'll throw it out. So Atmos mixes are forced, by definition, to be very dynamic. Very dynamic. And actually, one of the most fascinating things to me was, I remixed the last Tears for Fears album into Atmos, and I didn't do the stereo. The stereo CD was crushed. It had a dynamic range of like 4 or 5. It was really extreme.
Yeah.
So a lot of the fans were going to my Atmos mix and trying to create a stereo down mix because it had no dynamic compression, no mastering compression on it at all. It doesn't make sense to put dynamic compression on an Atmos mix anyway. Obviously, the reason you put dynamic compression on audio a lot of the time is to take the sort of rogue peaks out, but also to create that impression of energy and excitement.
Sure.
Where every time the bass drum hits, the track just ducks momentarily, and that's what gives sometimes the sensation of pumping excitement. But if things are spread out in the room, it's irrelevant.
Right.
It's irrelevant anyway. The kick drum here is not going to be affecting an acoustic guitar in another corner of the room. So this whole issue of dynamic compression becomes completely irrelevant, which for the audiophile I think would be something very attractive.
It's huge.
Yeah.
I think it's absolutely huge, yeah. I mean, I tried looking for the Franky Goes to Hollywood on Apple Music this morning.
It's not out yet.
Oh, okay, because I was like, I've got to hear that behind headphones.
40th anniversary, I think it originally came out in November '84, so they're looking at the 40th anniversary this year.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, you've talked about artists or labels coming to you. Do you ever go and like hunt for stuff that you want to do?
I certainly put the word out.
Right.
I certainly put the word out. Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes that has, led to work. Yeah, for sure.
Is there anything you'd really like to do that you can't get your hands on yet?
So many things. So many things.
Right.
I mean, the list is endless. I mean, I've been very lucky to have ticked off some of my bucket list. I have been able to tick off, but things like Talk, Colour of Spring, Spirit of Eden, anything from the Kate Bush catalogue would be a dream. I say in the presentation, any music where there's a degree of sound design, layering, texture, production-led music is perfect for spatial audio.
Right.
And these are also some of my favourite artists, so...
Because of your propensity to kind of lean to, well, not exclusively towards the left field, but more in that direction, right?
I'd love to, but you say that, but sorry to interrupt, but you said I'd love to do ABBA. ABBA would be one of my dream jobs. You can't get much more mainstream than ABBA, you know, or the Bee Gees, you know, something like that.
So if you did something like Laughingstock, that might actually make me consider installing an Atmos system in a lounge room just so I could hear that, because that would be incredible.
But that's interesting, because that's what we talk about. I mean, again, another thing I talk about in the presentation is the proliferation of catalogue that's coming out in Atmos. Record companies now are insisting all of their new artists deliver the album in Atmos and stereo.
Right.
Back catalogue is growing exponentially. You know, your favourite artist, you might say, well, my favourite artists haven't got their available. Give it 12 months, and I bet you it will be, because the record companies are going to all the catalogue now and trying to. And so there's always someone for whom that record will be their favourite record of all time. And that might be the record that pushes them over the edge to go and actually invest in an Atmos system. Think of all the people that went out and bought an Atmos system just so they could hear Sgt. Pepper.
Sure.
Or Dark Side of the Moon. You know.
So I think audiophiles have been through this promise of future content many times before with SACD, DVDA. In fact, I bought a 5.1 system in 2006 when the Talking Heads Brick box set came out, just so I could hear it. And it was endless promises of more content, and it didn't happen. And we had that with pure Blu-ray, DSD. So I think we're a little bit kind of jaded on that front of the promise of what's coming.
I understand, but the caveat to that is that we're already way, way beyond any of those scenarios you just painted.
Right.
92 of the top 100 best-selling albums in America last year, Dolby Atmos mixes available. All 8 of the top Grammy-nominated records in America last year, all available in Dolby Atmos. We're almost at the point, you know, and I understand this because I remember when I first got, my dad worked for Philips, so I was the proud owner of one of the first ever CD players when I was about 12 years old.
Right.
And there was literally, you would go into your local record store, there was a piece of A4 paper that had a list of all the titles that were available. And I remember thinking to myself, wouldn't it be, I bet Tangerine Dream's never going to be available on compact disc. Fast forward 20 years and there's more stuff on CD available than there was ever available on vinyl.
Sure, absolutely, yeah.
And I'm not suggesting we're at that stage with Dolby Atmos now, but we're well past the point you were talking about where 5.1 and quad and those things dipped off. There is a lot of catalogue out there, a lot of catalogue. I think Apple say something like 35% of all the material they have up online is available in
Really,
spatial
that
audio.
much?
Yes.
Holy smokes. Because my perception of it was, because my tastes are more left field, like pop music that's been kicked and walks with a limp is the kind of way I would describe it. So like, I just think about Galaxy 500 or The House of Love or even Future of the Left, which they would never do a Atmos mix, I wouldn't think.
Well, never say never.
I know, but it's
Never say never. Because I tell you, I remember going back all those years thinking there's certain things, they'll never be available. Those things will never get released on compact disc. And then, you know, now we're drowning in, you know, not only compact discs, not only they've been released on compact disc, they've been released on compact disc with the outtakes and the demos and the alternate versions. There's almost too much. I never say never. I mean, a lot of it will be down to the artist as well. Those kind of bands that are on more independent footing, it'll be down to them to be passionate about it. But the major labels, I think they're definitely interested in getting as much of their catalogue as possible out there.
So you're saying it's not just the way I would perceive it until today, is it's mainly top 100 American charts and then legacy, I don't want to call it old man music, but you know, Beatles.
No, I know what you mean.
You know.
I know what you mean. But it isn't just that. It isn't just that.
Right.
As you pointed out, I've done some more. You know, I've done almost the whole XTC catalogue. Now, XTC probably not quite Galaxy 500 in terms of cultdom, but not far up.
No, it's
not much
not
further
at all,
up from Galaxy. I've done their whole catalogue.
Right.
Why have I done their whole catalogue? Because A, the band are passionate, and B, I'm passionate.
Right.
And they've licensed their own catalogue from Virgin, so they can do what they want with it.
Ah, okay. So could you tell us about your Atmos setup in your studio? Well, what sort of, I mean, are you allowed to talk about the brands and the kind of the things you use there? Because it's PMC here, but you might not use it at home.
No, I use Genelex at home.
Right.
And I have a 7.1.4 system.
Okay.
So nowhere near as grand. I mean, I've never heard these mixes on a system as grand as the one I just heard here. It sounds good in my studio. It sounds great in my studio. So I have a 7.1.4 system. I've been using Genelex ever since I started doing 5.1 15 years ago, because that's what the guy that taught me to do it was using.
Ah, okay.
I say taught me. I watched someone do a 5.1, a guy called Elliot Shiner. I watched him do a 5.1 mix of one of my albums and thought to myself, I can do that. And so I went out and replicated his system.
Right.
So I've been using Genelex.
Yeah, okay. And do you find that some albums are just easy to do in Atmos and others you kind of really have to work hard to get something out of them?
Well, the hardest albums to do, and again, I talk about this in the presentation, the hardest albums to do are the ones where you risk pulling the glue apart if you start, particularly with rock music, where we're used to the drums, the bass, the rhythm guitars being almost this kind of gestalt entity that we can't get used to the idea that that would be separated out. So I have mixed certain albums where it was a challenge to find things to put in the other speakers.
Right, because I took the ABC debut and the Suede debut to the studio that Hans Martin Buff works on, and had a listen, and they're very different. So the ABC is, from what I recall, is more spread out in all directions, and the Suede, because it's a kind of like a dense guitar record.
Yeah.
If you pull that apart too much, is that one of those albums where you'd lose it a bit?
Yes, although at least the Suede record has a lot of extra overdubbing and textures. I mean, Bernard Butler overdubs so many guitars,
Right.
and there are keyboard parts and there are piano. I'm thinking more of your AC/DCs, your Rolling Stones, where a lot of the time the backing track is literally just drums, bass, and a couple of rhythm guitars. And if you start separating those things out too much, it doesn't sound like the Rolling Stones. It doesn't sound like, the AC/DC anymore. And I think it's fair to say that spatial audio is not right for everything. And I do say that in the presentation. I say, look, it's not right for everything. And I conclude by saying that it lends itself particularly well to progressive rock because it's by definition it's very layered. 80s production-led music of the variety of Trevor Horn's ABC, Franky, and electronic music.
Yeah, I'm amazed that, because I've where you went prog rock, I went in the 90s deep into IDM, like really into it.
Well, I went into that too, yeah.
Right, and I'm amazed, like Ortega, somebody like them, haven't embraced it.
Well, I can tell you exactly why, because I've approached Richard James and Sean and Rob from Ortega.
Right.
Everything they do, they just go direct to stereo.
Right.
So there are no multi-tracks.
Oh, I see. Okay, so that's never going to happen. Right?
No, so they make music in the old sort of fashioned way of just being DJs experimenting with like plugins and virtual instruments, and they just bounce it directly to stereo. So there are no multi-track tapes, but the idea would be to try and get them to be thinking about spatial audio from the inception of a project rather than retrospectively.
Yeah.
So then they can start to think more, well, we should create stems and we should do, but there are some electronic composers that do that, Max Cooper, John Hopkins, experimenting a lot with electronic music. I think spatial audio is a gift to electronic music because the sound is by definition more abstract anyway. So you don't have that preconception that perhaps a rock listener has, that the drums, bass and rhythm instruments are all coming from there, like they're playing on stage in front of me. You don't have that preconception. So I would love to see more of that kind of music. I'm a big fan of that music myself. Boards of Canada, amazing.
Yeah, fantastic,
amazing. Amazing in spatial.
I mean, you've mentioned the sort of the live connection, and I think one thing that I've thought about quite a lot is when I go to see a band, everything's coming from the front, the visuals, the sound. I mean, I know they'll have like maybe speakers, but they're not playing in surround sound. Like it's still a sort of stereo presentation. And Atmos is not like that. So there's a sort of a disconnect. Well, so how do you bridge that?
I mean, firstly to say, it can be like that, and some Atmos mixers do mix like that. So some Atmos mixers basically create what you call big stereo, which is keep everything in the front, just put the reverbs at the back, which is kind of what you experience when you go to a show. All the instruments are coming from in front of you, but you're sensing the reflections off the different surfaces in the room.
Right.
To me, as someone who creates spatial audio, it's boring. It's not what I want to do. And I think the reason for that is because when I originally fell in love with music, I fell in love with the idea of being able to make records. I didn't fall in love with the idea of being able to be on stage performing in front of people every night. I was never interested in that. I fell in love with the idea of being able to take listeners on some kind of journey across two sides of vinyl. I fell in love with making records. I say that because I didn't even want to be a singer or a guitar player. I wanted to make records. And so to me, hearing things like my dad play Dark Side of the Moon when I was a kid, brainwashing me with an album like that, I was so in love with this idea that you can create something almost analogous with a movie, watching a movie, in a record, in a pop record. So to me, spatial audio is the next step up from that. We can do all this stuff, we can be creative. So in much the same way that someone like Trevor Horn wasn't sort of like restricted by what potentially they might be able to perform live in the studio, he was just having fun, what can we do? It's amazing, And I feel the same way about mixing in spatial audio, you know. Let's have fun.
Do you think that 40 minutes is the perfect length for an album?
Yeah.
I do as well. And do you think that the CD era kind of gave artists too much runway to play with,
Yeah,
right?
made everything's bloated.
Yeah, I mean, I heard you talking about Bowie's Outside, and it is
Too
the
long.
best Bowie since the 70s, I think.
It's too long.
But it is a bit too long.
Too long, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I would love to hear in Spatial, but I don't know what the legal wranglings are for that kind of catalogue.
So I've approached David Bowie's estate. So David's whole thing was only the people that originally worked on the record are allowed to remix the records. So that would have to be Eno and Visconti working on that, yeah.
You and I are big fans of Momus, right? Which
Yes.
is a little-known artist, Nick
Yeah.
Curry, who has lived all over the world, now he's in Berlin.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, like, if you could pick one of his catalogue albums to do in Atmos, which one would it be?
Wow. I mean, his records are pretty lo-fi, which
Right.
is one of the things I like about them, you know.
But the Poison Boyfriend has quite a lush
Well,
production.
that was the one I was going to pick because my favourite Moments track of all is the Gate Crasher, which is the opening
absolutely
track.
fantastic, yes, yeah.
Opening track, and also there's Closer to You on it. Probably that one because it's kind of halfway between his more sort of singer-songwriter sensibility and his more electronic, so there's kind of both things going on. But I love The Tender Pervert, you know, Don't Stop the Night.
Yeah.
I mean, all those Creation records are just, the songwriting is just phenomenal. I covered a song off Don't Stop the Night called A Guitar Lesson, a very controversial one.
Very controversial.
Very controversial one, yeah.
Yes, you got
I did a cover of that, yeah.
We won't talk about that. I
No,
think we need to
best
be
not to read the
family
lyrics,
friendly.
Yeah.
And do you think somebody, because I know you're a big fan of the Red House Painters, I only really like the first couple of albums. Is that the kind of music that would go well in Atmos, or is that one you'd probably want to leave alone?
Do you know what? I think that would work, and the reason it would work is because there's a lot of space and there's a
Right.
lot of reverb. And again, one of the things I talk about in the presentation is that sometimes music is quite sparse, but if reverb is a very big part of the fabric of the music, as it is with, you know, with Red House Painters, some of his vocals just sounded, you know, like almost had like this church-like ambience.
Yes, yeah.
I would love to do things like Katie's Song and Roller Coaster and Grace Cathedral Park. I think that's a band that would work.
Right, okay.
In Spatial, because there's so much space
Yeah.
inherent in the music anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think we'll wrap it there, Stephen. Thank you very much for your time. I know you're a busy man and you probably need to lie down right now.
Pleasure. I've still got to go and do one more presentation before I can go home.